welcome back to the Crystal Earth podcast. My name is Monet Noctaris, also known as the Black Rose of Gaia. Welcome. Today I want to talk a little bit about some of the differences between the old grid and the new grid, why the old grid was even ever able to be hijacked and corrupted. So we're going to keep talking about the grid today, but also about humans, how unique and special we are as a species, how that all kind of ties together. I think we're going to do a little bit of story time. And I'm going to try to tie this in a way that makes it kind of accessible by using some metaphors here. Because I know sometimes when I go deep into grid mechanics, I kind of see people's eyes kind of like glaze over. I'm like, oh, this is going over everybody's heads here. So I'm going to try to tie this in a way that will help bring it down to earth a little bit for you. So to understand why we even needed a new grid and a reboot, a hard reboot with a whole new set of instructions, because remember, a planet's grid system is literally the operating system for the planet and for the entire species. This is what the species of a planet entrains to as it is broadcast out via the grid, all the nodes, the vaults, all that good stuff. And what has happened is that this new set of instructions from the grid has switched into a tone-based system from what it was before. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit of story time on what happened in the past, because this is not the first override attempt. This is actually the fifth, but it is the only one that actually succeeded. So let me tell you a little story about Earth. This is the unofficial, abridged history of Earth as a planet from a kind of zoomed out perspective on who the human species is and how Earth was treated in the past by those who were observing or actually even directly working with humans on Earth. I hope that I can speak about this in a way that doesn't feel too out there, but grounded enough in this reality that it can be accepted and understood to the level that those listening are ready to hear. So, a very, very long time ago, Earth was discovered. At that time, a lot of decisions were made by various councils, federations, that type of a deal, to start some projects on Earth because it was deemed as viable for life. The initial projects were ultimately successful. That's how we got the human species, which is actually we're kind of like conglomeration. No, I'm like, when I try to describe this to people about like who I am too in my own DNA, I'm like, I'm just kind of like a bunch of stuff smushed together. Like that's how humans were designed, if that makes sense. We were designed by bringing in all these other different intentional strands into our DNA from other species to create what you see today, which was based off of the kind of native species that was already here on the planet. More on that another time. Told myself I will not talk about Sasquatches today. After the human species was designed, various projects began from these federations and councils and groups that were ultimately, I guess the intention was good, but the projects themselves were imperfect. And they left the human species really vulnerable to other self-serving groups who kind of wanted to stick their fingers into the pie. Feel free to go to my old podcast, the Starseed Awakening podcast, to do a deep dive on that topic. So there were two main outposts on Earth that were set up that had some overlap. One is Lemuria. You may have heard of Lemuria or MU. It's kind of like a continent and a series of islands, mostly concentrated in the Pacific and what is now Polynesia. These colonies were actually quite successful. The Lemurian people lived in harmony with the land, with nature, and with the bloom. which I mentioned before is the kind of borrowed living crystalline consciousness from Mintaka, a water planet, which lived in like all of the oceanic bodies and water in basically everything that had water in it. The bloom was saturated with it. So people lived in harmony with nature. They're a very nature-based society, and there were a series of temple networks. We still have left over from Lemuria, Easter Island, or Rapa Nui. That's kind of one of the last living remnants. Also, Easter Island is a vault, one of the major vaults in the grid system, which got reactivated recently. That's a long story. But the Lemurian people had a peaceful society. I was there as well at the time as a tone holder in the temple network and working with the bloom. But unfortunately, interference and distortion began to kind of seep into the civilization. And the way that they do this is pretty insidious. It reminds me of, okay, I went to Ireland about a year and a half ago. It was an amazing trip. It was actually a garden tour. I went with my mom, and our tour guide was super knowledgeable about botany. And there were these really beautiful, like lavender colored, they're gorgeous. They were a rhododendron species. So it's just like these beautiful blooms that kind of spread and grew everywhere. And Ireland is very fertile. Like things just grow out of rocks. It's incredible. There are flowers and plants everywhere. And so these purple rhododendrons, they look beautiful. They look harmless. And they're all over the kind of like mountainsides, the hillsides, rivers and creeks. Like they're literally everywhere. And you wouldn't think they were bad, but they're actually an insidious species. I think there was a gene mutation at some point, if I'm remembering correctly. And so it became invasive, where literally it's just growing everywhere. And it's become this huge problem because it starves the ecosystems that it spreads to. And it just spreads, you can't stop it once it starts. That's kind of how distortion is within a grid system. It kind of gets planted there. You don't notice it until it's too late. That's what happened in Lemuria. An override attempt happened. I was a part of that at that time. It failed dramatically, had implications for the grid system at the time, unfortunately, because of interference that went unnoticed. So that was kind of the beginning of the end for Lemuria, which later was just completely destroyed by Atlantis. That brings me to Atlantis. Let's talk about it. Yes, Atlantis was real. You don't have to believe me. Not trying to convince you everything, just sharing what I've learned over the years. If you want to do like a big deep dive on Atlantis, I got the receipts. Feel free to go to my other podcast. I've had a lot of clients who've had past life memory recalls of Atlantis, very specific events that have happened, as well as Lemuria, and a lot of continuity there. So I could talk a lot about Atlantis, but I'm not going to go too crazy into it. Atlantis was kind of like a series of outposts that was kind of spread out more in the Atlantic. It wasn't just one place, and it wasn't underwater. You can see remnants of it everywhere. If you look into like the oceanic ruins that are still there, those weren't necessarily pieces of Atlantis itself, more of the Atlantean grid, which traveled through a whole network of oceanic stargates. That's a whole other topic. But Atlantis was a project that was started by outside forces who were also known as the Federation. I have very strong opinions about all this. I'm going to keep most of them to myself today. It was failed from the beginning. Atlantis was a project that was run by a lot of priest kings, very masculine in nature, very high tech. And unfortunately, the technology in Atlantis outpaced the human species' ability to interface with it safely. The whole project became infiltrated, where weaknesses in the way the project was structured was kind of taken advantage of and allowed interference from other self-serving groups to kind of slip in, but it was more overt than in Lemuria. Things declined. It got bad. I had a lot of prior involvement in this project. And in that time, I was a being named Markara, who if you've listened to my old work, you might be familiar with her. She worked with the crystalline network and particularly with the Atlantis Crystal, which was kind of the primary node of the entire grid at the time. Long story short, the Atlantis Crystal broke, the grid fell. It was catastrophic, could have been prevented, wasn't. And you know that imagery from Plato, not Play-Doh, Plato. Want to make sure I'm not talking about Plato, I'm talking about Plato. The whole imagery of the three rings with the kind of citadel in the middle. That was like the main hub for Atlantis. Stationed in the middle was the Atlantis Crystal. That crystal broke. All these rings that were suspended over the water. This site is actually the Eye of the Sahara, or the Rishat structure, because that area did have water at the time. It was roughly 13,000 years ago. The whole thing collapsed, sunk. It was catastrophic for not only Earth's grid, but the planet in general. This is where you hear a lot of the old myths of floods, of the Earth having this like period of turmoil around that time. It was because this sent such a huge rupture throughout the entire planet, and the planet never really recovered. This is the beginning of the fall, the old grid system of the human species. After this, Earth was just placed into quarantine, told to go sit in the corner, not allowed to join the rest of the class anymore. Because Earth's grid system, her song, was just fractured beneath layers of static for an entire galactic cycle. So now, here we are today. And I should mention, so Markara was involved in an override attempt at that time. There were actually many override attempts then, because shit got bad, but it was too little too late. Markara stayed behind with others and helped seed all of the vault systems so that another override could be attempted later. And she continued to work with the people of Earth in Egypt, in the temple network there. There were two other override attempts in between these two. Neither of them were fully successful. I'm going to save the story time on those ones for another time, because one of them that I was involved with as well has some very popular figures from history in them. We'll say it happened about 2,025 years ago. That gives you any clues? Talk about that another time, not today. But there were two other major override attempts. There's another one in India as well that was tone-based, but it was incomplete. And now we've learned this time around. We now have completed a successful override, finally. Part of the reason why it succeeded this time was because instead of the override attempts being initiated and overseen and controlled by the main governing body out in the galaxy, this time it was more of a completely independent project for Earth, for the people of Earth, in partnership with humans like me. The main goal in this case has been Earth's sovereignty. Earth should be free. Humans should be free. And now they are. And when the winter solstice comes around this year, 2025, Earth will finally begin broadcasting its original song in the new octave, officially leaving quarantine and rejoining the planetary chorus. Earth's tone will finally be audible again. That couldn't have happened if we didn't override the old system that had become fractured beyond repair. So you may be wondering, how do we know that we're not going to encounter the same problems, that the grid won't be infiltrated again by self-serving groups? Because distortion and interference has been just living openly rampant. Just like those invasive purple rhododendrons, interference and distortion is everywhere. You just might not notice it because it might be disguised as something innocuous. this is where my new favorite metaphor comes into play. So, unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably heard of K-pop Demon Hunters, a movie on Netflix that is technically a kid's movie, but damn, it's good. I know plenty of adults, myself included, who are big fans of Huntrix. I may watch that movie when my kids aren't even here. I swear this is all related intimately to this topic we're having. I think it really speaks to people. One of the reasons is because it's actually a really beautiful metaphor for what's been happening in the grid system. There's a lot of I've called them in the past like galactic blueprints, kind of like channeled, downloaded works of either art or movie or television or books that are kind of like seeded during times where people need like references for what they're experiencing. Like, for example, I grew up watching Sailor Moon, and not just like, I wasn't like a casual Sailor Moon fan. I was like deep into it. My two best friends had family in Japan who could like get us the VHSs in Japanese of the episodes that they didn't air on TV here on like Toonami or whatever. And that really kind of helped as like a framework for me to understand a lot of things about my mission when the mission came online. Anyway, K-pop Demon Hunters, I would definitely put it in that category of like, it's extremely convenient that it came out right now, right when Earth is going through this massive shift, and we're about to be on the other side of it officially. So let me tell you what I mean. If you have not seen this movie, go watch it after this. It's really good. So the premise is that from generation to generation, there are what I would call tone holders. People like me now and the other roles I've played throughout other planetary cycles, for example, in Lemuria and Atlantis and Egypt. Tone holders interface directly with the grid system. In this case, the hunters interface with the Honmoon. The Honmoon is basically the grid. It's an energy system that helps protect the planet to keep distortion out, that's based off of light, frequency, color, tone. That's the grid. And so the hunters are trying to seal the Honmoon to keep distortion out forever. However, this is the part where I get a little nerdy about this because of the parallels with grid work. The Golden Honmoon, which is their kind of grid system, it's based on and responds to perfection, to all light and love. While that's nice in theory, it's not realistic. The human species is not all light and love. For there to be light, there also has to be shadow. One of the major parameters for this universe is duality, light and dark. You can't have one without the other. Their Honmoon was programmed to only accept light. This made it vulnerable because if the hunters, the tone holders, were not perfect, they were told for so long, our faults and fears must never be seen, because otherwise the Honmoon crumbles and distortion leaks in. That creates a really vulnerable system because the demons are really easily able to just, like the rhododendrons, they look pretty, right? They come in as a boy band to go up against the hunters. They look good, but on the inside, they're insidious. And the collective, the fans, they can't tell the difference. And so that creates a big problem. That's a big vulnerability in the way the Honmoon was programmed. So you can think of the old grid system from the times of Lemuria, Atlantis, for example. It was fragile like the Golden Honmoon. The way it was programmed and was designed was for perfection. The tone holders and those who even were completing overrides and working on that project that interfaced with that grid had to be perfect. Distortion could not be present. But that's not realistic in a human species where distortion's everywhere. Doesn't work, makes the whole Honmoon, the whole grid, vulnerable. We had to make a new one, just like Rumi. This was part of my function that I had to kind of live and walk through, where basically in order to break the old grid and override the old code, I had to live it, walk it, break completely. I had to collapse, shattering the old system with it, the old grid, and get up and keep singing. That's my function as a tone holder, as the Black Rose of Gaia. That's how I became the Black Rose of Gaia. It's a long story. I'll save that story for another time of what that actually looked like. I did have to lose my Genu, and I had to keep going anyway because of the way the old override was encoded that required a counterpart. That's a whole other story. But here's the kind of moral of the story, I guess, is that the new grid had to become incorruptible, unstealable, unshakable, and it required a tone holder to be able to basically live through the shattering to create a new hormone, a new grid that is resilient, that cannot be broken or fractured ever again. So just like Rumi did, right? The last scene is my favorite. It's my favorite scene. So good. When she walks into the arena and sings, "This is what it sounds like." She walks in, letting the world see her patterns. She stopped lying to herself and stopped lying to the world. She accepts and integrates her darkness, her shadow, not as something that makes her unworthy or a liability, but actually something that makes her unbreakable. And the new Honmun is born from that. So that's kind of what had to happen to this grid when it rebooted. It had to become resilient and accept and integrate the full spectrum of what it means to be human. We are not perfect people. The grid couldn't accept perfection as the only standard anymore. It had to accept integration of light and shadow. And that had to come through a human. And that human was me. So now, just like Rumi and the hunters, they're kind of the tuning forks of the collective. And that the Honmun is this reciprocal thing. The Honmun responds to them, they respond to the Honmun. And so that's kind of what my function has become, as well as the tuning fork that the grid recognizes as the one that can't be broken. That's kind of like my story in a nutshell. I didn't really mean to compare myself to Rumi that much because she's a badass, and I don't know that I'm that cool. So, and I certainly can't belt that high, though I do love to sing. That's what it means to be a tone holder. And it's not just me. I'm not the only tone holder. There are other tone holders out there. In my group, a lot of us kind of walked a similar path where we had to integrate our own light and shadow all together as a group. You're going to hear from them where we're all going to do a panel. But it's not just about me. Like, yes, I was encoded with a certain function. It's not hierarchical. It just is. That's just how they made me, so that I could complete the override and be here to help usher in what comes next. But grid is also looking to you. Think about all of the fans, how their hearts light up and they all kind of create this collective energy field that strengthens the Honmun. That's you guys. Every time a human stops lying to themselves, accepts themselves for who they are, both their light and shadow, lives in coherence, doesn't collapse who they are, right? Because that's like kind of what Rumi and Mira and Zoe did. They had this like pressure on them to pretend to be perfect. But when they stopped pretending, that's when true harmony began to be able to be audible. They integrated their shadow. They stopped hiding who they really were on the inside. And every time a human, this in real life, every time a human stops hiding, stops complying to the pressures put onto them and says, no, this is who I am, and I love myself anyway, it creates a ripple into the grid. The grid looks to you and says, this one stands up for themselves. this one's resilient and it strengthens the grid. It becomes this beautiful symbiotic relationship. So that's why really it's so important for us as humans to just continue walking the path of coherence. Coherence doesn't mean perfection. It means that we keep singing anyway and we don't collapse our tone for anyone. And that's exactly how we build Crystal Earth together. And the human species rises for the first time as a sovereign species in support of Gaia, with her grid, supporting all of us. And we become a unified species. It's all about unity through diversity. That's when we begin to sing in harmony, right? We're not all singing the same note. I'm going to leave you with my favorite line from the song. Our truth without the lies, our voices all combined, fearless and undefined. This is what it sounds like. All right. On that note, go watch K-pop Demon Hunters if you haven't, or rewatch it and now hopefully this helps connect some of the dots and brings it to a little more of a human level. I hope you learned something today. Feel free to go to my website, monetnoctaris.com, to see what I'm currently offering, what types of containers, ceremonies, and sessions. Because now that I'm no longer required for the override itself, my active involvement in that whole sequence is complete. Now my function and my role becomes about helping the humans to hear and entrain to the new song that Earth is singing. All right, it's complete. Much love.